What I wanted to talk about this afternoon is about research onions, not surprisingly, and then linking them to methodological fit and golden thread. And it's really the picture on the first slide of this, what comes up on a sat nav, is to try and get over the idea that there's not just one route, but the route you take has to be clear and justifiable. And what you get out of a sat nav it depends on the parameters you put in. And so if you take, I want to get to a place here, or please tell me how to get to place A from place B, that's almost like the equivalent of a research question. So I like to start off with a question. So what I'm going to cover is I'm going to start by looking at the meaning of golden thread. And just to say it's not a lager beer, but it is if you're out here in South Africa. Then I want to look at how do we get to see golden threads and what do they appear like and when do they not appear? I then want to sort of delve back into history because I've never actually talked about why a research onion and how it developed, and then move on to how can we use the onion? Because one of the things that has hit me time and time again when talking to colleagues is the first thing they tend to say to me is, not another onion. Please don't ever write anything else about it because we keep on seeing it in all these dissertations and assignments and nobody seems to know how to use it. So a little bit about how it might be used and questions to ask at each layer. Then I'm going to move into issues of methodological fit and bringing it all together. A little bit about how do we use it to demonstrate rigor and robustness and of course fit. And then like all user presentations, we'll finish with a few references at the end. And Stephanie said, can I talk for about an hour-ish? And those who've heard me before, I will try my best, I promise. So here I am as a Lego person, but what do we mean by a golden thread? So let's think, what do we think it means in research terms? And what do we think its components might look like? So let's think that through. The golden thread is this idea of an overall argument that runs, or idea that runs through the entire project. And so it has to fit together. So you can see a logic and coherence with it. So if we go back to one of the earliest research methods books, I really like the one by Raymond, that he was always talking about this idea that you didn't have logic leaps in your research. And so a golden thread is something where you can see the logic of the argument and there's no leaps within it. And it runs right through a research project. So the idea then is, and it links to methodological fit and the work by Edmondson and McManus, there's a fit of the whole points coming together. And when we look at the components, we're thinking of the research aims or the research objectives and research question for the project, and then a lot of other components that runs through it. So we actually have the methods, we have the literature review, and then we have the findings, and everything fits all the way through joined together. So let's think, does this actually have a golden thread? I'd like you to read this to yourselves, and then you don't have to put anything in the chat, but just think, does this piece of text actually have a golden thread running right the way through it? And then I'll talk you through it as to where the issues might arise, because this is actually comes with a bit of adaptation from a student's work of what they were talking about in relation to golden thread, in relation to their own research, in their research proposal. It gives an idea of what we're trying to do. So read it through and see, is there a golden thread running right the way through? Okay, you've probably had enough time because, like all academics, you'll be skim reading things through because you've had a lot of practice assessment work. So let's now look at this in a bit more detail. This research is based on a premise that very little is actually known about why formal organisational change programmes have such a high rate of failure. So immediately here, we're saying that we've got a new topic where not a lot is known. So we're already thinking it's more likely probably to be inductive research. The next thing is it says the aim is therefore an in-depth exploration. Well, that fits quite nicely with inductive research of the possible reasons for such failure. In particular, the study will look at the interpretations of failure by senior managers. So there we see it set up as an in-depth type study. We see it looking at interpretive, and we see it's an area which the student is writing about and saying it's not new. Now, notice the colours change, but We now have to move into the method. 200 questionnaires have been sent to senior managers in Bristol to test the relationships between common causes of failure and their effects. Hang on, what's going on here? We said at they've said at the beginning very little actually known, and now we're saying they're common causes of failure. Well, how would we know they were common and what their effects were, and be able to test relationships if little was known? The responses were analysed statistically using SPSS. The key finding is that resistance to change is the most common cause of failure of formal organisational change programmes, which supports previous studies. Hang on, at the beginning it said there was very little known. And then it's saying we're doing quantitative analysis, and yet earlier it was an in-depth exploration, which is qualitative. So what we see is halfway through this piece of text, the golden thread is actually breaking or broken completely, and it's jumped. And this is something we quite often see, not only in our own students' work, but early when we get articles for journals, sometimes this is the same thing when people are writing and submitting. You think, hang on, it doesn't hang together. So let's have a look at this. What do we mean by methodological fit? It's just about internal consistency amongst the elements of the research project. And so I put the elements here in the color code in links back to the previous piece of text we're looking. So the research question and prior work, that fitted together, but then the research design didn't. And in the piece I put in there, there was no contribution to literature. And this idea of methodological fit goes right back to the early noughties with Edmondson and McManus. So we're now looking at work which is nearly 20 years old, but is still as relevant as it always has been. So what we're saying is, within the context of prior work or existing literature, how does the research design, the research strategies, data collection, data analysis, all fit together with each other, and then actually enable the research question we set up to be answered? And then that has to also fit in with the broader philosophies of how the researcher sees the world, how they're going to develop their theory or use theory, and then also with the underpinning research, and so the research that's already been done and how it contributes to the literature. How does it generate new ideas, perhaps new theories, or if we're doing applied work, perhaps practical insights into the world of work? And it's the whole idea of actually getting the stuff to fit together. So what I want to do is to actually take these ideas and actually start to use the research on so how this can be used to actually help generate methodological fit with a series of questions that go together with it. So, but before that, let's actually talk about why have an onion. I mean, I was sitting talking to my partner about this, and she said, "Why an onion? Why? What about a courgette and what other vegetables?" But if you look at when a courgette's chopped out, you don't actually get any interesting patterns or something useful to hint at layers. Similarly with an aubergine, beautiful colour, lovely tasting vegetable, doesn't really help. Red cabbage is my favourite vegetable to look at. Very beautiful, but again, you don't get this idea of layers. And with an onion, you have to get to the center, the core of how you're actually going to do your research. You have to work your way or peel through a series of layers to actually get to the way you're going to do the method. And the layers impact on what's actually in the middle. So, in terms of how the ideas came about to myself, back in the early noughties, I was doing some work on cultures and organizations. And like everybody at that time who's looking at cultures and organizations, I was reading Gert Hofstede's work. And I came across his cultural onion. I thought that's really interesting. You start at the outside and you get to the more the nub of things in the middle. And as I thought about that, I thought, isn't research a bit like that in that the method is dependent upon your philosophy, the way you approach research. In those days, I was thinking only about deductive and inductive. Abductive hadn't really crossed my brain that much. I was thinking of some research strategies, time horizons, and then all those led you to the actual data collection. And that appeared in the second edition of the Research Methods book, despite one of my co-authors saying he didn't like it at all. So sometimes you stick up for what you believe. By 2009, it had moved a bit further. We now started to have different methodological choices, or by those days we called them just choices. We had mono methods, mixed methods, and multi methods, and the philosophies were increasing in number, but the general ideas were still the same. And then it became a bit more stuck together, and we put in terms of approaches to theory development, abduction came in, and so the model gradually took more detail, and you can see there we've got more research strategies starting to be. But it's the same idea of you think about the outer layers and then you move in to start to focus down. But where you are in the outer layers impacts on the way you can actually do your research later. It doesn't actually define you must, but it actually starts to constrain choices. And what we have ended up with now is the 2023 research onion, which we can see there. The thing is, though, is thinking about where do you start? Now, in an ideal world, I suppose you'd say we start at the outer layer and work your way inwards. But some people could start with a method and say, "Oh, am I going to do cross-sectional, longitudinal? I like doing questionnaires. So which am I going to do?" Then they say, "Am I going to do a survey or am I going to do an experiment?" Then they start talking about mono and multi, and say they work their way out. That doesn't. It's almost like backfitting. I don't think that works well. What probably tends to happen is people start from the outer and work in it, but they go back and forth between the layers more. Or it could be something else, but it gives you an idea of how it might all fit together. So the purpose of the onion, which I think sometimes gets forgotten, it's depicting these different layers or aspects of research which you need to be clear about before you go out and collect data. And as I stressed before, they're very clearly interlinked and they underlie the choices that we as researchers make and as our students make, but they're not deterministic. If you choose to be a particular person, a critical risk, you do not have to do quantitative research. You do not have to be deductive. But they do tend to start to constrain. And the idea behind it is to get people to reflect on who they are as a researcher in the outer layers and their research frame of reference, and then to start to plan on the basis of who they are, how they might undertake the research to answer the question they're interested in. And that's really the idea of how it should become to do. And these layers are like a metaphor, which we talked about, the onion of peeling, and the center is difficult to get to. And then the each layer prompts you to justify a choice. So we can now start to actually look at the different layers and then the prompts that could come through it. So with all this, I'm assuming there's a research question or an overall aim. And the prompts will start off at the broader assumptions within which your research is based, your philosophy, and then how you're going to approach the development of theory. Are you going to be inductive, deductive, or abductive? And we'll talk about that more later. Then we move into the next layer where we look at more specific things. So we look at the methodological choice, mono, multi, and mixed methods. We start to look at different research strategies. We start to look at different time horizons. And then finally, when we've sorted all those ideas out, then we end up with the actual procedures, data collection procedures, and the analysis techniques. So it's a fitting together, but it's the outer layers start to constrain what you're going to be doing on the inner layers. So, for example, it'd be very unlikely to see a positivist doing in-depth qualitative work. And so we start to see things moving round. So the first thing to say is when we look at the philosophical layer, it doesn't show every philosophy. And I've had numerous people come up and say, why haven't you got this philosophy? Why haven't you got feminism? Why haven't you got whatever? And the honest answer is that these are the ones that tend to be used the most, and you could always put in more, but it's ones that tend to be different. The other thing which is quite interesting is there's two camps. One of camps, we've just done the research for the next book, and half the people are saying you've got too many philosophies, and the other half are saying you haven't got enough, and in particular you need, and then it's whichever one they use themselves. But what we were really getting people should think about is, what are your assumptions about reality? What are the assumptions you make about the nature of knowledge, your epistemological beliefs? And then how much do your own values impact on research? How much do your own beliefs? And I look at this now as I read it, I think, well, my axiological beliefs, my epistemological beliefs, and my ontological beliefs have changed so much during my research times of doing research. I mean, starting from a PhD, which was highly positivistic and a lot of statistical modelling. And now I'm doing almost entirely qualitative work. So these are not set in stone and people will change, but it gets you to think about you, what you believe about reality, what you believe about the nature of knowledge, and whether you can be removed and be completely objective in your research or not. And just as an aside, it can be diagnosed using a lovely little tool that Alexander Bristow at the Open University and myself developed a few years ago, which we called HARP, Heightening Awareness of Research Philosophies. The next layer is approaches to theory development. So, not surprisingly, the question is, what is your approach to theory development to answer your research question and meet your aim? And here we're looking at are you going to be doing deductive? So you're going to collect data to test existing theory. Are we going to be doing inductive to build new theory or adapt theory out of data? Or are we going to be doing abductive? So when you're actually starting off in either deductive or inductive and something weird or something unexpected happens and you think, I wonder if, and so you start to modify. A surprising fact is how it's put in literature. So it's thinking about that before you actually start. And again, what tends to happen is you may well start as deductive, inductive, and sometimes people actually move to being abductive within that. Then the next layer is the methodological choice. And this is about what forms of data best answer your research question to meet your overall aim. But you've got to make sure it fits back for your research philosophy, your approach to theory and development. And here we're looking at quantitative methods or a quantitative method or multiple quantitative methods, a single qualitative method or multiple qualitative methods, and then mix them either simply just starting with one and moving to the other or having a series of different ones and so on. And the crucial thing here is not just what are you doing, but also why is it sensible if you're using mixed methods to actually mix methods? What extra does adding two methods together give you than using those two methods separately would do? So it's actually thinking about the added value of what you're doing. We then start to move down in the layers. So we start to look at strategy or strategies. And here it's which ones will best enable you to answer your research question and meet the overall aim, but which fit with your research philosophy and your approach to theory development and your methodological choice. And so over time, we've seen a series of ones there, and they become more and longer. I'm sure people in the audience can think of additional ones which should go in there, but it's the idea of thinking about what makes sense in terms of a research strategy given the methods in general terms that you want to do, your methodological choice, whether you're inductive, deductive, or abductive, and then your research philosophy. So it's starting to narrow it down further. And then we start to think about the actual time horizons. And here we're saying, and here it's about the timescale data collection you're working, what are the deadlines? And there we start to thinking about, are we going to be using primary or secondary data? Secondary data is wonderful. It actually allows us to do more longitudinal research, but also it does allow us to collect data, to use data we wouldn't be able to collect ourselves. But it's always what's best to enable us to answer our research question. And that's the really crucial thing, and or meet the research aim. And then it has to fit back with the research philosophy, approaches to theory development, the methodological choices, and the research strategy. So all the time, it's so there's the number of constraints are increasing as to the way we might design the method to answer a specific research question. And then very finally, we get to the techniques. What data do you need to answer your research question, meet your aim? And this is about how you gain access, how you select the sample. We talked a bit about primary and secondary, and then data analysis takes, and then we bring into the ethics, the ethical aspects. And that basically says, here are some ways of actually starting to get the onion. But the crucial thing here is how it actually starts to help us to actually get to having a methodological fit and bring it all together in a way that is clear and transparent in method. And one of the things which has really struck me over the past few years is how methodology sections within journals have been getting, journal articles have been getting longer in describing what they're doing, but how certain aspects, what we've been talking about here, in particular research philosophy, are very, very rarely even mentioned in the journal articles, and other aspects are done in a lot more detail, in particular the actual data collection. And there's different journals have their different styles of what's expected. And we'll look at this, and we'll also look at the advice that's given on this. So let's look at methodological fit and the golden fit. And really what we're actually looking at is how perhaps from the picture, when we make things, wouldn't we make these joints? How does everything dovetail together to actually fit and make it work? So it's your methodological choice, your research strategies, you're going to collect the data, how you're going to analyze it, and they're all in harmony and all fit together. They support one another, as you can see in that lovely picture, and they enable the research question to be answered within those broader assumptions, research philosophy and approaches to theory development, and then, of course, the literature. And is it coherent? And as we saw with that initial one taken from some students' work, quite often it isn't. Now let's have a look at this. And this is, I just wanted to put this slide in because one of the things which keeps on striking me is with students say, oh, I just take a line, just draw a line from positivism through mono method, through experiment to cross-sectional, and I get that's how I do positive and critical realism. I can draw another line. It doesn't work like this. So a positivist could do a mono method, they could do survey, it could be cross-sectional, and then we get into perhaps questionnaire design or indeed secondary data. If we were to take somebody who was an interpretivist, inductive research, a single qualitative method, let's say they're doing grounded theory, again, it's a cross-sectional piece, and we'd perhaps see there some form of a series of interviews or perhaps some focus groups. Let's see, we don't know. And then finally, if we take the last one of a pragmatist, they were abductive, mixed methods. They do mixed methods, simple action research. So it's a longitudinal design collect over time to effect change within the organization. But it's not as simple just fitting together. These concentric layers of the onions can move around back and forth to actually make a design which has clear methodological fit and will actually enable the research question to be answered. Let's now move a bit to journal guidance and what the journals actually tell us. And I actually decided it would be interesting to look at the 52 top business and management journals. And by top, I mean the 3s and 4s. And the first thing is the information for contributors. They talk about a range of methods. They normally say we accept quants, quals, and the main mix. Then they talk about wanting high quality research. Well, that'd be interesting to define. That's a different presentation. They want research that's the best practice, and then they all very often talk about rigorous and undertaken robustly. And then we get to the methods. They say in your methods section, it must be accurate. So actually say what you do, sufficient detail, okay, provide a rationale and discuss the limitations. And then from some work I did with Darabi, thereby ensuring trust and confidence in the application and the findings. So you get an idea of how that all will start to fit together. So if we look at rigor, it's about the strength and quality of the research method used in terms of design, data collection, and we can now start to see the links back to methodological fit. I've quite a
Hello,
Hello?
Mark. We lost you there for a second. Maybe go back a sentence or two. At least
Sure,
I
sure,
lost
sure.
you. Maybe it's just
Yeah,
me.
it's all right. It said my internet connection just popped up as being unstable, which is surprising because we just put fiber in. Oh well, never mind.
That is
Right.
life. Maybe just go back to sentences so people don't.
Okay. Do you want to start with robustness or with rigor?
I think we had rigor. I
Okay.
feel that unless it was
Let's
more.
carry on with robustness then. Robustness is quite often seen as a quantitative concept, but the idea being behind it that the research methods used isn't affected by changing the method variables. And you can see that just by the use of the labeled variables, that it's just more quantitative. So that the conclusions remain valid and sound. So we're looking here about, hence the picture lighthouse, about how this will shed light on methodological fit, but also on the quality of the research. And really, I think that methodological fit can be seen as part of rigor and robustness, or perhaps even the other way around. Rigor and robustness are part of methodological fit. Perhaps something to talk about later. The journal guidance though we get is limited. They say they have lists, and they say which occasionally name example data collection and analysis strategies that are appropriate. So it's appropriate to use I'm trying to think now. You know how your mind goes blank when you think, but they will say it's appropriate to use the Goya method if it's a qualitative one, or they'll have some quantitative equivalent of methods they like. But when the prescriptive advice is offered, it's nearly always focused on quantitative research and saying we expect you to use this sort of thing and to do it in this way. And whenever they talk about qualitative or mixed methods, Matt Salverson puts it really nicely as they reflect neo-positivistic norms. So it's sort of saying write about doing qualitative work in positivistic ways. And then they say things, if it's deemed illuminating, we suggest you summarize the approaches to inquiry and the researcher's philosophical stance. But that rarely happens. And even more rarely, despite there being an increasing number of these, they don't say, have a look at our editorials about how to do methods, or what about using checklists or journal article reporting standards. And they very rarely talk about the issues of methodological fit. And yet that to me seems really crucial. So what I did was I actually decided I'd try and see how this all fitted together. And the first one we're actually looking at is demonstrating rigor with it. And so I've gone through it and tried to pull together all the ideas in there. So for qualitative research, the quality criteria which seem to be increasingly used, although I would say people also use the quantitative type criteria, credibility, dependability, confirmability, and transferability. When we look at how is this demonstrated, the crucial thing is it's about demonstrating what you've done and why, stating limitations, and then within that talking about the role of the research within this. We're looking at issues of reflexivity, insights into bias. So I still remember writing a paper a few years ago looking at patients' responses to patient errors and thinking about, well, having worked in social services for a number of years, I'm sure that impacted on how I was looking at the data I was getting at. So I actually said that my co-author at the time had worked as a nurse. So we were actually saying inevitably this is going to impact on how we look at what we're doing. But it's also about being open about this and then giving a rationale for the choices made. And when you're looking at qualitative, it's about thinking about what paradigm am I working in. So when we start using journal article reporting standards or GRAMS, which is good research. Hang on, I wrote it down because I was looking at this and thinking good research about reporting a good research for a mixed method study. If we start using that jars for qualitative research, they may not work that well because it's very different depending on the nature of the qualitative you work. So there's almost like a health warning on that. And the journal article reporting standards, it's fascinating how quite a few journals actually say you should be using these, and yet when you read the articles, they don't. And we'll come back to that as well. Then we look at the qualitative, where we're looking at validity and reliability. I always see I use these and think about validity as being, is it measuring what it's supposed to be measuring? And reliability, does it do it repeatedly the same way? And here again, we were looking much more quantitative. So we demonstrate this by transparency of exactly what we've done in terms of the tools we've used to collect the data and the techniques we've used to analyze it. Are they appropriate? So we get ideas here of methodological fit coming in. Is there a good rationale for these? Is there this idea of internal consistency fitting in just within these techniques? And that consistency going also into not only the collection, but the analysis of the data. So it starts to fit together. Here, I would argue that journal article reporting standards are less problematic, especially because there's a more of a done way of doing things. Mixed methods, if we look here, the quality criteria as for each component and the demonstration is as for each component. So we've got the yellow bits coming through again on that middle row. But here, I think the importance here is also, and it's been written about by in the Academy of Management Journal. Here, the issue is about when you're combining why and what is the added value of combining quants and quals, or quals and quants, to just doing one method or each method separately. What does it bring to doing them together? And the use of journal article reporting standards depend on the mixing and how you do it. So they may or may not be appropriate. And there's quite a lot of work on journal article reporting standards. People like Joe Cornelissen have done a lot arguing very strongly against it, which again is a very good read. Now we look at we've looked at the demonstration there of rigor. Now we're looking at robustness. And robustness, and again, you can see the links here to the ideas of methodological fit coming through. Robustness here is looking at the coherence within the philosophical lens, methodological coherence, and also this consistency or logic, the fit going across the different elements of the research that we've been talking about. And again, the likely philosophical lens would be expect to see there is a pluralistic one. So perhaps interpretivist or postmodern, just to take two of the ones that appear on the onion. For quantitative, the robustness is demonstrated by findings holding across a broad range of data and, crucially, which sometimes isn't there, the limitations being stated. And we're not surprised, and he's put a lightly philosophical lens there of positivist. When we move to mixed methods, it's as for each of the components, plus, as we said before, this clear rationale for combining methods. And then people always seem to say that the likely philosophical lens for mixed is pragmatist, but critical realists also do mixed methods. I think it's important to stress that. I can remember talking to Alan Bryman about this a few years ago, about how mixed methods was more than just pragmatism. So where does this leave us? I want to try and bring some points together here. The first is that what we read in journals has methodological gatekeepers, and these are the reviewers, the editors, and the assessors when we come to students' work or other people's work, like doctorates. And they decide what is and isn't good research. They decide what methodological fit is. And that, given the joys we have of actually finding reviewers now, perhaps is something we need to be a bit worried about. Are we actually having people who are able to devote the time needed to check for this idea of methodological fit and read it with enough in-depth knowledge to do so? The next summary point that comes through is we do need to have a transparent method section, which is accurate. And the question here is, are method sections written to reflect what was actually done, or are they written with post hoc rationalization? Or is it a bit of both? But it has to contain sufficient detail to actually apply the design. So somebody would come along, and if nothing had changed, they could do the same thing. And it would hopefully generate the same sort of data. Of course, in reality, that will never happen. But that's, again, what we're trying to actually look for. And justified with a clear argument and linking back to the literature to say so where possible. Then we move on to the ideas of rigor, which again links into part of it. It should be appropriate to the overall design. For qualitative, credible, dependable, confirmable, and transferable, with this idea of a consistent logic that flows through it. For quantitative, we're looking at the ideas of validity and reliability, and again, transparency, what's happened, and again, consistency. Mixed, look back at those previous components, but then why are they being combined? And what is it that this combination gives us that doing it separately didn't? Robustness, again, appropriate design, and we're looking very much in qualitative research, this methodological coherence, this idea of a consistent logic. And it's quite interesting to sit and read your own work and see, have I actually done this? It's actually quite scary at times. And then quantitative, the findings hold across a range of data. And then with mixed, we had the added value of combining. So we start to see, again, these coming together. But now let's go back to where we started, this idea of fit. For all the elements of all designs, we need to ensure that it's methodologically coherent and be able to argue that and justify it. So there's a consistency with the philosophy within which the research has been undertaken, be it positivist, interpretivist, pragmatist, critical realist, and so on and so on. There's also a consistency with the approach to the theory development, the theorizing style. So does the philosophy link to an inductive research, and does the rest of the design, if it doesn't link to an inductive research, and does that follow through in terms of theorizing the way the data is collected? Similarly with a deductive design is, does it start to link through? So perhaps a positivistic design using quantitative data, perhaps through surveys or big data sets, and then and so quantitative, and then so on in the theorizing style. And then we also need to recognize that despite what some journals are saying, when you actually look at the reality, the associated advice given in checklists, journal article reporting standards, or good research and mixed method studies, it can be supported, but it can be completely and utterly inappropriate. I actually sat down and tried to write something for a piece of quantitative work and a piece of qualitative work using the journal article reporting standards from the American Psychological Association, and I couldn't answer every single one of their questions in under 3 or 4 pages. So it's obvious that that isn't being done. Editorials are increasingly giving quite critical advice on how to report on a quantitative study, a qualitative study, mixed method study. And that needs to be looked at and considered critically, also in the light of what the journals are doing. And method sections for target journals give you the best insights in what the reporting new norms are for those journals. And that really is where I'd like to leave it. Other than to say, I put a fair number of references in. I put the APA Journal Article Reporting Standards in. The Edmondson and McManus paper is an absolute joy to read. Then there's the mixed methods one by Jose Molina Arizona, which is really good about quality there. There's Job Corneliussen's Rigor with or without templates for qualitative research. I put the Hofstadter in. I put the RM book just so you can get the onion. There's the paper which we wrote on articulating scholarship with a large number. I did the one on the method sections, and then the Vellman paper in Academy of Management Journal is fantastic on mixed methods. They call it in that paper multi-methods, but so on. And then I'll finish with a plug for the YouTube channel, which is we've got about 70 videos on that I've done so far, and there's a few guest videos as well, which are really quite fun. And I think, Stephanie, I'd probably like to leave it there and stop sharing if that's okay with you.